In the decades following the consolidation of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, the Group of Soviet Forces Germany, known by its acronym GSFG, represented the most forward-deployed and logistically concentrated element of Soviet conventional power. And sustaining this formation required the construction and maintenance of an extensive, permanently embedded logistics network across East German territory, designed not merely for garrison life, but for immediate transition to high-intensity combat operations on the Central Front, because GSFG was structured to serve as the first echelon of a potential Warsaw Pact offensive into West Germany, and therefore had to maintain forward ammunition stocks, fuel reserves, rail distribution hubs, and repair infrastructure at a scale sufficient to support multiple combined arms armies without reliance on immediate resupply from Soviet territory. And from the 1950s onward, the Soviet Ministry of Defense invested in a layered sustainment architecture within the German Democratic Republic that integrated rail marshalling yards near major garrison clusters, hardened ammunition depots dispersed across forested zones, bulk fuel storage complexes positioned along key transport corridors, and dedicated pipeline segments connecting storage facilities to air bases and armored concentrations, forming a dense logistical ecosystem embedded within East Germany's transportation grid. And unlike rear area structures located in Poland or Western Soviet republics, GSFG logistics operated in a compressed geographic space where peacetime garrison activity coexisted with warplan prepositioning, meaning that depots were constructed with both daily supply turnover and wartime surge capacity in mind, often measured in days of supply for entire tank and motor rifle divisions stationed within rapid striking distance of the inner German border. And rail infrastructure served as the backbone of this system, because heavy equipment and bulk munitions arrived primarily by train from the Soviet Union through Poland, entering East Germany via designated transshipment corridors, where rail gauge compatibility and scheduling priority were coordinated in advance to ensure uninterrupted freight flow, and major rail hubs near cities such as Magdeburg, Leipzig, and Frankfurt an der Oder functioned as distribution nodes from which ammunition trains were dispatched to divisional depots and fuel tankers were allocated toward armored regiments, with throughput measured in train loads per day under mobilization assumptions. And GSFG planners maintained detailed normative consumption tables, estimating artillery expenditure, fuel burn rates per tank battalion, and replacement requirements for spare parts during the initial operational period, enabling depot managers to calibrate stockpile size according to projected offensive tempo of 30 to 40 kilometers of advance per day during breakthrough and exploitation phases, and bulk fuel storage, was particularly critical, as mechanized formations within GSFG were heavily dependent on uninterrupted diesel and aviation fuel supply, prompting the construction of large-capacity storage tanks concealed within wooded areas or near rail sidings, often reinforced with earth berms to mitigate blast vulnerability, and linked by pipeline networks capable of transferring thousands of cubic meters of fuel forward to regimental distribution points without reliance solely on truck convoys, reducing exposure to interdiction and ensuring continuous refueling capability even during rapid maneuver and forward ammunition. Infrastructure included hardened bunkers dispersed to prevent catastrophic loss from a single strike, with munitions categorized by caliber and operational priority, allowing front headquarters to allocate artillery shells, rockets, and anti-tank missiles according to pre-assigned fire plans integrated into Warsaw Pact operational art, and maintenance and repair facilities were positioned within relative proximity to combat units, yet sufficiently rearward to provide sheltered workspace for armored vehicle refurbishment, with capacity measured in vehicles repaired per 24-hour cycle. reflecting a doctrinal emphasis on preserving combat mass during the initial phase of a conflict. And throughout the Cold War, NATO intelligence assessments consistently identified the density and distribution of GSFG logistical installations as evidence that the Soviet Union intended to sustain immediate offensive operations from East German territory without pause. Because the scale of forward ammunition depots, fuel reserves, and rail capacity indicated readiness for high-tempo combat rather than mere defensive posture, and thus the GSFG logistics network emerged as a permanent forward sustainment system, designed to anchor Warsaw Pact war planning in Central Europe, embedding stockpile depth, rail throughput, fuel storage capacity, and ammunition dispersal directly into the geography of East Germany to ensure that Soviet forces stationed there could transition from garrison to full operational tempo with minimal delay at the outbreak of hostilities. As the GSFG matured through the 1960s and 1970s, its logistics network evolved from a garrison sustainment framework into a fully integrated forward operational rear designed to support immediate transition to front-level combat without waiting for large-scale reinforcement from Soviet territory. And this transformation was driven by the doctrinal assumption that the group of Soviet forces Germany would constitute the first operational echelon in any Warsaw Pact offensive, requiring that ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, and replacement cycles during the initial 3 to 5 days of combat be covered almost entirely by stockpiles already positioned within the German Democratic Republic. And to achieve this depth, GSFG maintained extensive ammunition storage complexes dispersed across Brandenburg, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia, many located in forested or restricted military zones with rail spurs extending directly into depot perimeters, allowing dedicated military freight trains to deliver artillery shells, tank rounds, rockets, and small arms ammunition without transshipment through civilian yards, with unloading capacity measured in rail cars per hour and storage volume calculated to sustain multiple armies at projected high-intensity fire rates defined by Soviet normative tables. And these depots were organized into layered echelons, including central group-level storage, Army-level forward depots, and divisional ammunition points positioned within shorter truck haul distance of frontline units, creating a cascading distribution chain designed to maintain continuous resupply even if one node were temporarily degraded, and fuel infrastructure mirrored this structure, with bulk storage tanks often holding tens of thousands of cubic meters of diesel and aviation fuel, connected via fixed pipeline segments to nearby air bases and armored garrisons, reducing reliance on road tanker convoys and enabling rapid transfer to regimental refueling points during mobilization, while mobile pipeline units trained to extend flexible hose networks forward in successive increments if units advanced westward, and GSFG rail hubs formed the structural backbone of this sustainment system, because rail transport offered the highest volume movement for heavy ammunition and fuel shipments arriving from the Soviet Union through Poland, and designated border crossing points handled scheduled military freight with priority routing to pre-assigned depots, minimizing dwell time and ensuring that surge shipments under mobilization could be accommodated without disrupting the established distribution rhythm. And maintenance and technical support infrastructure was similarly embedded with permanent armored repair plants located near major garrisons such as Wünsdorf and Eberswald, capable of conducting engine overhaul, track replacement, and fire control system servicing at rates calculated to return damaged vehicles to operational status within 48 hours under surge conditions, thereby preserving armor density during the opening operational period. And GSFG planners maintained detailed records of daily consumption rates for each division under various combat scenarios, translating these figures into required stockpile tonnage held at each depot and into transport scheduling assumptions that defined how many trains per day would be needed to replenish forward stores if combat extended beyond initial projections. And NATO intelligence services throughout the 1970s assessed that the scale and density of GSFG logistics infrastructure indicated a deliberate forward sustainment posture rather than a purely defensive deployment, because the prepositioned ammunition and fuel capacity appeared sufficient to support sustained high-tempo operations without immediate reliance on deep rear supply. And thus by the late 1970s, the GSFG logistics network had become a mature, permanently embedded operational rear area integrated into East Germany's rail and pipeline grid, calibrated to sustain multiple combined arms armies during the critical initial phase of a potential Central European conflict. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the GSFG logistics network reflected decades of refinement under evolving Soviet operational doctrine, particularly as concepts of deep operations and operational maneuver groups emphasized rapid exploitation beyond the inner German border, requiring that forward deployed forces in East Germany possess not only immediate ammunition and fuel depth, but the capacity to expand sustainment flow westward without interruption. And this requirement shaped the configuration of rail hubs and storage complexes throughout the German Democratic Republic, where military-controlled rail spurs connected directly to ammunition bunkers and bulk fuel farms, allowing entire train echelons of munitions or tanker wagons to be offloaded under controlled conditions without reliance on civilian infrastructure beyond mainline transit. And GSFG planners calculated rail throughput in terms of train pairs per day on designated military corridors, ensuring that mobilization surge traffic from Poland and the Western Soviet republics could enter East Germany without exceeding marshalling yard capacity, while internal redistribution within GSFG territory relied on a layered schedule of Army-level dispatch to divisional depots, often structured to maintain several days of forward stock at each echelon, measured in tons per division and cross-referenced against normative expenditure tables for artillery fire plans and armored maneuver, and fuel storage installations were strategically positioned near major armored concentrations, often constructed with multiple large-capacity tanks interconnected by pipeline segments and protected by earthen berms or camouflage, enabling rapid transfer of diesel to regimental distribution points at rates sufficient to sustain sustained tank operations projected at hundreds of kilometers over a multi-day period. And in parallel, aviation fuel storage near GSFG air bases supported forward-deployed tactical aviation units, with pipeline links reducing reliance on truck convoys and preserving operational readiness under conditions of simulated interdiction, and maintenance infrastructure expanded to include specialized repair battalions equipped to conduct field-level overhaul of engines, transmissions, and fire control systems, with capacity calculated in vehicles processed per 24-hour cycle during high-intensity combat, ensuring that mechanical attrition would not rapidly degrade armored strength. And the integration of these elements was coordinated through centralized rear service commands embedded within GSFG headquarters at Wünsdorf, where supply status reports from subordinate armies were consolidated daily, enabling dynamic reallocation of ammunition or fuel if one sector consumed material faster than projected, reflecting a doctrinal commitment to centralized control of sustainment flow. And NATO assessments in the 1980s increasingly focused on the density of GSFG depots and the volume of fuel and munitions believed to be stored forward, estimating that stockpiles were sufficient to support several days of continuous combat without immediate reinforcement, a capability that compressed the window for Western countermobilization. And exercises conducted within East Germany rehearsed rapid transition from peacetime storage to wartime distribution, testing the ability of rail crews, depot personnel, and pipeline units to operate at surge tempo, with unloading rates measured in rail cars per hour and forward dispatch intervals calibrated to align with projected breakthrough timetables. And thus, by the final decade of the Cold War, the GSFG logistics network stood as a highly integrated forward sustainment system, combining rail hubs, dispersed ammunition infrastructure, bulk fuel storage, and repair capacity into a cohesive operational rear, purpose-built to sustain the initial offensive momentum envisioned in Warsaw Pact war planning across Central Europe. As Cold War tensions intensified during the early 1980s, and NATO's adoption of air-land battle signaled a greater emphasis on deep interdiction of rear areas, the GSFG logistics network was adapted to increase survivability without sacrificing throughput. Because Soviet planners recognized that forward depots and rail hubs in East Germany would likely be targeted by precision strikes and therefore introduced additional dispersal, camouflage, and redundancy measures across ammunition and fuel infrastructure, expanding the number of smaller storage sites rather than concentrating all munitions in a limited set of large depots, while retaining centralized inventory control at group headquarters to preserve allocation flexibility, and rail distribution plans were modified to incorporate alternate unloading points and pre-surveyed bypass routes around critical bridges, enabling military freight trains entering from Poland to reroute quickly if primary marshalling yards were degraded, with railway troops assigned contingency repair responsibilities to restore damaged track segments using prefabricated components stored within GSFG territory. And bulk fuel facilities were hardened with reinforced containment and earthen shielding, while additional mobile fuel distribution battalions were positioned to shift stock between depots by tanker convoy. If fixed pipeline segments were disrupted, ensuring that forward regiments would continue receiving diesel at rates aligned with armored maneuver projections, and ammunition handling procedures were rehearsed under simulated air threat conditions, reducing time between railcar arrival and dispersal into storage bunkers to minimize exposure, with throughput measured in tons per hour during surge drills, and GSFG Rear Service Command implemented more rigorous reporting cycles, requiring subordinate army depots to transmit daily consumption and inventory status upward, allowing group-level planners to rebalance stocks across East Germany if one axis showed disproportionate expenditure, reinforcing doctrinal emphasis on centralized control under distributed infrastructure. And maintenance and repair units were likewise adjusted to operate under dispersal conditions, with certain workshops relocated closer to wooded zones and equipped with mobile repair platforms capable of relocating rapidly if targeted, maintaining vehicle recovery capacity measured in battalion equivalents per day even under degraded facility conditions. And NATO intelligence assessments during this period noted both the density and dispersion of GSFG depots, concluding that the network was structured to absorb initial interdiction while preserving sufficient stockpile depth to sustain at least several days of high-intensity operations without immediate reliance on deep Soviet rear echelons. And exercises conducted within East Germany validated these assumptions by simulating partial rail disruption and fuel transfer rerouting, demonstrating that while throughput could be temporarily reduced, the layered sustainment architecture allowed GSFG to maintain operational tempo in line with Warsaw Pact planning assumptions, and thus by the mid-1980s, the GSFG logistics network had evolved into a hardened, redundant, and centrally managed forward sustainment system, combining rail hubs, dispersed ammunition storage, bulk fuel complexes, and adaptable maintenance infrastructure into a cohesive operational rear, capable of sustaining Soviet forces in East Germany during the critical opening phase of a Central European conflict envisioned in late Cold War war planning. Another defining characteristic of the GSFG logistics network during the late Cold War was the integration of peacetime garrison sustainment with immediate wartime mobilization architecture, because Soviet forces stationed in East Germany were maintained at high readiness levels, and their daily supply cycles were deliberately structured to align with rapid transition to combat footing, meaning that storage depots, rail schedules, and fuel transfer systems were not dormant reserves, but continuously exercised components of a live logistical grid. And this dual-use configuration required careful inventory management, in which ammunition stocks were rotated to prevent degradation, while maintaining aggregate tonnage at or near war plan targets measured in days of supply for each army, often calculated at 3 to 5 days of intense operations without additional inflow from Soviet territory, and rail hubs supporting GSFG functioned under standing priority arrangements that allowed military freight to supersede civilian cargo during surge conditions, with marshalling yard layouts designed to accommodate rapid assembly of dedicated military trains carrying armored vehicles, bulk munitions, or tanker wagons, and dispatch intervals were rehearsed to ensure that under mobilization, the network could sustain multiple train echelons per corridor per day without exceeding siding capacity, while fuel storage complexes were positioned to serve both routine base operations and rapid-scale refueling of armored columns, connected by fixed pipelines where possible and supplemented by mobile tanker battalions that trained for continuous shuttle operations between bulk storage and forward refueling points, maintaining transfer rates calculated in hundreds of cubic meters per hour under peak demand, and aviation logistics within GSFG further reinforced this layered design, as air bases hosting tactical aircraft were supplied through dedicated fuel farms and munitions bunkers located within short rail or pipeline distance, allowing sortie generation to continue even if road movement was constrained, and maintenance depots within East Germany were equipped not only for routine service, but for surge-level repair, with spare parts inventories sized to restore a significant percentage of damaged vehicles within 48 hours based on projected attrition models derived from Soviet operational art. And centralized rear service command at Wünsdorf maintained a consolidated logistics picture that integrated rail arrival data from Polish corridors, depot inventory levels across multiple districts, fuel flow rates through pipeline segments, and maintenance throughput figures, enabling group-level planners to anticipate shortages and reassign shipments proactively. And NATO analysts consistently observed that the density of GSFG's forward stockpiles and the sophistication of its rail and fuel infrastructure suggested a deliberate strategy to decouple initial offensive capability from immediate reinforcement dependency, allowing Soviet forces in East Germany to launch and sustain high-tempo operations from pre-existing stores embedded within the host nation's geography. And thus, by the late 1980s, the GSFG logistics network represented not merely a support system, but a forward operational sustainment platform whose integration of depots, rail hubs, fuel storage, and repair infrastructure provided the structural foundation for Warsaw Pact war plans centered on rapid, sustained maneuver across Central Europe. By the final years of the Cold War, the GSFG logistics network embodied the cumulative integration of rail mobility, fuel depth, ammunition dispersal, and centralized command oversight into a permanent forward sustainment architecture whose scale and readiness were calibrated specifically for the Central European theater. And this architecture rested upon a dense lattice of rail corridors connecting Soviet supply routes through Poland to distribution hubs inside the German Democratic Republic, where military-controlled marshalling yards were capable of handling successive freight echelons composed of flat cars loaded with armored vehicles, boxcars carrying munitions, and tanker wagons transporting diesel and aviation fuel, with unloading rates measured in rail cars per hour during surge drills and onward dispatch windows assigned according to pre-approved mobilization schedules. And these hubs fed a tiered system of depots organized at group, army, and divisional levels, each stocked according to normative consumption calculations that projected artillery expenditure, tank ammunition burn, and fuel usage under breakthrough and exploitation conditions, enabling GSFG to maintain forward reserves sufficient to support several days of high-intensity operations without reliance on immediate reinforcement from the Western Soviet Union, and bulk fuel complexes located near major garrisons such as Jüterbog, Eberswalde, and Neuruppin contained large storage tanks linked by pipeline segments to adjacent airfields and armored concentrations, ensuring rapid transfer capacity expressed in cubic meters per hour and reducing dependence on vulnerable road convoys, while mobile fuel distribution units trained to reposition stock between depots if fixed infrastructure was degraded, preserving supply continuity under simulated interdiction. And ammunition infrastructure was similarly layered and dispersed, with hardened bunkers concealed within wooded zones and rail spurs extending directly into storage perimeters to minimize exposure during unloading, allowing shells, rockets, and anti-tank munitions to be sorted and allocated to subordinate armies based on centralized directives transmitted from Wünsdorf, where Rear Service Command consolidated daily inventory reports and consumption forecasts to maintain equilibrium across axes of advance, and maintenance capacity complemented this sustainment depth, with permanent repair facilities equipped to overhaul engines, transmissions, and turret systems at rates aligned with projected attrition models, and forward repair battalions prepared to evacuate damaged vehicles to sheltered sites within hours of recovery, preserving armored mass during the initial operational period envisioned in Warsaw Pact plans, and NATO intelligence estimates during the late 1980s consistently assessed that GSFG's forward logistics density significantly compressed warning time for Western mobilization, because the presence of prepositioned ammunition and fuel stocks embedded across East Germany meant that Soviet forces stationed there could initiate sustained combat operations almost immediately upon political decision. And although geopolitical change accelerated rapidly after 1989, the logistical network itself remained structurally intact through 1991, representing decades of deliberate planning that integrated rail throughput, fuel storage capacity, forward, ammunition infrastructure, and centralized rear service management into a cohesive operational rear designed to sustain Soviet forces in East Germany during the decisive opening phase of a potential Central European war. As political transformation accelerated across Eastern Europe after 1989, and the Warsaw Pact's military cohesion began to erode, the GSFG logistics network remained in place as a tangible manifestation of Soviet forward operational planning, and its sheer scale revealed the depth of preparation embedded within East German territory over 4 decades, because rail marshalling yards still retained sidings sized for armored equipment trains. Fuel farms maintained large capacity storage tanks calibrated in tens of thousands of cubic meters, and dispersed ammunition depots continued to hold stockpiles aligned with normative consumption models developed for high-intensity operations. And even as force reductions commenced, the architecture of the sustainment system illustrated how deeply integrated GSFG had been into the German Democratic Republic's infrastructure, with dedicated rail spurs, controlled access storage complexes, pipeline segments, and repair facilities physically woven into the landscape, demonstrating that Soviet planners had anticipated prolonged forward basing rather than temporary expeditionary presence. And retrospective analysis of depot distribution patterns indicated that ammunition infrastructure had been intentionally dispersed to reduce vulnerability to NATO air interdiction, while preserving centralized control through detailed reporting channels back to Wünsdorf headquarters, where Rear Service Command maintained daily oversight of inventory levels, fuel flow status, and maintenance throughput, allowing dynamic reallocation across armies if one sector experienced higher projected expenditure, and rail integration with Polish transit corridors underscored the strategic logic of GSFG sustainment, because freight flow from Soviet territory could be reinforced rapidly along pre-assigned routes. Yet the forward stockpiles already positioned in East Germany ensured that initial combat operations would not depend on immediate resupply, compressing response timelines and reinforcing Warsaw Pact war planning assumptions about rapid offensive momentum, and fuel infrastructure similarly revealed layered redundancy, with fixed pipeline segments linking storage facilities to air bases and armored garrisons, supplemented by mobile tanker battalions capable of redistributing diesel at surge rates calculated to sustain continuous armored maneuver for multiple days, and maintenance facilities across GSFG territory provided both routine service and surge-level repair capability, enabling damaged vehicles to be restored to operational status within compressed intervals, and thus preserving combat density during the critical opening phase of a hypothetical conflict. And although the Cold War concluded without the activation of these plans, the GSFG logistics network stood as an enduring case study in forward sustainment architecture, demonstrating how rail hubs, bulk fuel storage, dispersed ammunition depots, and centralized rear service command were integrated to sustain a large mechanized force permanently stationed in East Germany, embedding logistical depth directly into the geography of the Central Front and shaping NATO's threat assessments and reinforcement planning throughout the final decades of the East-West confrontation. When examined in full from the early post-war consolidation of Soviet forces in the German Democratic Republic through the withdrawal process completed in 1991, the GSFG logistics network represents one of the most densely constructed forward sustainment systems of the Cold War, because it combined permanent rail integration, bulk fuel depth, dispersed ammunition infrastructure, and layered repair capacity into a unified operational rear designed to support immediate high-intensity combat without reliance on distant reinforcement. And this system was anchored in the rail corridors linking Soviet territory through Poland to East Germany, where military-controlled marshalling yards and dedicated spurs enabled the rapid delivery and redistribution of heavy freight, measured in train echelons per day under mobilization conditions, feeding tiered depots stocked according to normative consumption tables that projected artillery, armored ammunition, and fuel requirements for multiple combined arms armies over successive 72-hour operational cycles, while bulk fuel complexes concealed within wooded zones provided transfer capacity in thousands of cubic meters and were linked by fixed pipeline segments to air bases and armored concentrations, reducing dependence on road convoys and enhancing survivability under interdiction assumptions. And ammunition depots were intentionally dispersed and hardened, each connected by rail for rapid replenishment, yet managed centrally through Rear Service Command at Wünsdorf, which consolidated daily inventory and consumption reporting to maintain balanced distribution across sectors. And maintenance infrastructure further reinforced this depth by combining permanent overhaul facilities capable of restoring vehicles within 48 hours with forward repair battalions positioned to to evacuate and process damaged equipment rapidly, preserving armored density during the opening phase of operations envisioned in Warsaw Pact planning. And NATO intelligence assessments consistently interpreted the scale and organization of GSFG's logistical installations as evidence that Soviet strategy depended on immediate offensive capability from East German territory, supported by several days of forward stock, sufficient to sustain high-tempo maneuver before additional resupply from deeper echelons would be required. And although geopolitical change rendered these preparations unused, the logistical architecture itself demonstrated a coherent integration of rail throughput, fuel storage, ammunition dispersal, and centralized command oversight embedded directly within the terrain of East Germany, illustrating how Soviet military planning fused sustainment depth with forward basing to shape the operational calculus of the Central Front throughout the final decades of the Cold War.